Hello and welcome to Samuel's Fortress. I'm your host Kirill, and today we're going to be discussing the life of John Vincent Atanasoff, the Bulgarian American who invented the first computer. And in order to do that, we will be using the book The Man Who Invented the Computer, the biography of John Atanasoff, digital pioneer, by the Pulitzer Prize winning novelist Jane Smiley. John Vincent Atanasoff's father, Ivan, was born in 1876 in the midst of a period of climaxing political unrest. His parents were landed peasants in the Bulgarian village of Boyajic, about 80 miles from the Black Sea and perhaps halfway between Istanbul and Sofia. The Ottoman Empire was breaking up. Serbia had won independence in 1830 and Greece in 1832. Revolutionary agitation in Bulgaria, which intensified in the 1870s, culminated in the April uprising of 1876, in which bands of Christian resistance fighters attacked Ottoman government offices and police enclaves. The attacks were followed by a campaign of reprisal on the part of the Ottoman government. Ivan's father, Atanas, and his mother, Yana, were forced to flee their village, Atanas carrying the baby Ivan in his arms. In the course of the melee, Yana was knocked unconscious, and Atanas was shot in the back. The bullet that killed Atanas creased the baby's skull as it exited through his father's chest, but Ivan and Yana survived, though American translator Eugene Schuler estimates from his own observations at the time that 15,000 Bulgarians were killed and 5 monasteries and 58 villages, including Boyajic, were destroyed in these attacks. The revolution was put down for the time being, and the Ottoman response was widely publicized and deplored. And then, in mid-1877, Russia attacked the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans with the express purpose of liberating the Balkan Christian states and regaining access to the Black Sea that Russia had lost during the Crimean War. The conflict was short. The autonomy of Bulgaria was recognized in the Treaty of San Stefano, signed March 3, 1878. Among the Russian cheerleaders for the war were Ivan Turgenev, who thought Bulgaria should be liberated, and Fyodor Dostoevsky, who hoped to unite all Eastern Orthodox churches under the Russian Church. Yana subsequently married a local cattle breeder who could afford to educate little Ivan, while her brother made contact with the American missionaries who helped get him to America. When this uncle returned to visit to Bulgaria in 1880, young Ivan, now 13, decided to go back to America with him. Yana financed the trip by selling a piece of land that Atanas had left her. At Ellis Island, Ivan Atanasoff's name was changed to John Atanasoff. Although he had a little bit of money, it was only enough to rent a room in New York City so that he could work at a series of menial restaurant and handyman jobs while he improved his English. Life was difficult and jobs were scarce, though he did manage to keep a chicken in his room for a while. A charitable local minister he met through his uncle found him a place as a student at the prestigious Petty School in Hightstown, New Jersey, not far from Princeton, where he worked hard and did well. But upon graduation, his education at first seemed to be of little use. His uncle had returned to Bulgaria, and there were no more family funds forthcoming. He was homeless for a while, working temporary jobs. But then he related his tale to a Baptist minister named Cook, who encouraged him to seek the aid of various local congregations. Once he had accumulated $200 in savings and gifts, Pastor Cook helped him find a spot at Colgate, at the time a Baptist-affiliated college. At Colgate, John met the sister of 2 brothers who were fellow students, a girl named Eva Purdy, the descendant of early settlers in Connecticut and generations of farmers in upstate New York. Eva, herself a high school graduate with a talent for mathematics, was teaching in a nearby school. After courting Eva, John married her at Christmas 1900 and then graduated from Colgate the following June. John Vincent was born on October 4th, 1903. Now, although Ivan graduated college with a degree in philosophy, he did not find work as a philosopher, but actually as an industrial engineer. He worked at various power plants, electrical plants around the New York City area, and in the meantime, at nights, he was also taking courses in electrical engineering. During this time, Ivan and his wife would have 4 children, 2 of which survived and 2 of which unfortunately died in infancy. Of the 2 children that survived, John was the oldest. However, There was a lot of issues while they were living up in New York City. Health-wise, Ivan and his family were suffering from a lot of respiratory issues, chronic respiratory issues that are believed to be a result of kind of the industrial environment, the industrial atmosphere, which was having a lot of negative effects on the family's health. So what Ivan decided to do was to move his family down to Florida, where he thought the climate and the atmosphere would be more hospitable and wouldn't be as detrimental to his family's health. Down there, he found a job working in mineral extraction, I think exploiting the phosphate deposits that existed down in Florida. Once he got down there, he purchased a 150-acre farm. 30 of those acres were orange groves, and the other 120 acres were timber. And young John Vincent, the son, he spent a lot of time on that farm growing up, kind of taking apart farm machinery and learning all the various farming techniques with his father. Eva Atanasoff gave her oldest child considerable freedom, both of action and of thought, in part because other children were born in Florida. Eventually there were 7, and she oversaw a large garden in addition to the household. But Eva also retained her interest in intellectual pursuits. According to family stories, she liked to sit in her rocking chair and read, while John and his younger brothers and sisters played about her. By the time young John got to school, he already knew how to read and calculate, and at first he was a difficult pupil. He was used to following his own agenda. Since he had no trouble doing his work, he finished ahead of the other children, and once he had done so, he made himself a pest, according to his younger sister. But he was an inconvenient pupil also because he was inquisitive and knew more than many of his teachers. He was easily offended, especially by teasing and slurs, and he didn't mind getting into fights. Some teachers handled him well, and some did not. But however they handled him, his pronounced eagerness to learn persisted. He eagerly explored both the countryside and whatever books he could get a hold of. In 1913, when he was not quite 10, John helped his father wire their home for electricity. Subsequently, they wired the homes of some of their neighbors too. In 1914, John mastered the owner's manual of his father's new Ford Model T, and at 11 he was driving it. John read his mother's books, including Ruskin and Spencer, and he read his father's books, including a manual on radio telephony, wireless sound transmission. When his father ordered an up-to-date slide rule, then decided that he didn't really need it, John mastered it within a couple of weeks, and thereupon became, in his own mind, a nascent mathematician. He found his father's old college algebra book and began to work his way through it. What he could not understand, differential calculus, infinite series, logarithms, Eva explained to him. During this period, he learned about various number systems other than the decimal system. This unusual familiarity with non-decimal ways of counting and calculating, and his practice using them, was what would eventually distinguish his ideas about calculators from those of his contemporaries. After graduating from high school, John Atanasoff would take a year off to work as a phosphate prospector. However, after that 1 year, he would enroll in college, and in 1921, he became a student at the University of Florida. By the time he began college, Atanasoff knew he wanted to study physics and to be a physicist. He was familiar with and excited by Einstein's theories and by the work being done in the field, but no physics major was offered at the university, so he went into electrical engineering, the most theoretical scientific major offered. In Gainesville, Atanasoff was surrounded by opportunities to think, but also by opportunities to do. Requirements of the electrical engineering major included building models and projects, so Atanasoff took classes in machine shop, forge and foundry, and electrical mechanics. He also pursued his earlier interests in radio communication. He tutored students for money and worked summers. One summer in Jacksonville, he found a lucrative job surveying the city streets. He was, in short, brilliant, eager, enterprising, highly directed, and hard-working. Just as Ivan Atanasoff's life had been almost a paradigm of the classic immigrant story, John Vincent Atanasoff's life was almost a paradigm of the classic ambitious American tale. A Tom Sawyer-like boyhood followed by a Horatio Alger-style, self-funded and successful career. In 1925, when Atanasoff graduated from the University of Florida, he had the highest grade average ever recorded up to that point in the university's history. He applied to master's programs in physics, his true love. The first to respond with offers of admission and aid was Iowa State University. Atanasoff accepted the offer and made plans to go to Ames, Iowa. Sometime later, he received an offer from Harvard, but he turned it down. Now, while John was away at college, his father, Ivan, was almost killed for the second time in his life for being a Bulgarian. When he was walking home one day from work, Ivan was ambushed by a group of Klansmen, a group of members of the Ku Klux Klan down in Florida, and he was almost beaten to death. He was actually saved by his wife, who came running out of the house with a shotgun and scared off the attackers. Ivan suffered a broken leg, several broken ribs, and suffered from severe internal injuries. He was in bed for several weeks and almost died. Turns out some of the locals did not appreciate having a foreigner living in their town. At Iowa State, John would earn a living by teaching mathematics to undergraduate students while he pursued his degree in physics. He reportedly stood out at Iowa State due to his Bulgarian last name, but also due to his southern accent, having grown up in Florida. He was actually given the nickname, the Mad Russian. Apparently the students there at Iowa couldn't be bothered to tell the difference between a Bulgarian and a Russian. He taught his math students and took his own courses, and these activities were time-consuming. However, Knapp Street was not far from Fraternity Row on Ash Avenue, and it was there, at a mixer for Southern students, that he met Laura Meeks, who came to Iowa State from Cheyenne, Oklahoma, a place at least as wild in its own way as Florida. Laura was somewhat older than John, but still an undergraduate, putting herself through college. Her personality was in many ways the female counterpart to John's. She had always played the piano, painted, done wood carvings, and written poetry while working on the family farm and doing chores on neighboring farms for cash. At Iowa State, she was on the tennis team and swimming team, and she was a devoted reader, like Eva. Herself intelligent, energetic, and enterprising, she recognized both John's talent and his ambition. They were married shortly thereafter. He received his master's degree in physics in June of 1926. Atanasoff then accepted a position at Iowa State for $1,800 per year, teaching mathematics and physics while taking more classes to prepare for his doctoral studies at another land-grant institution, the University of Wisconsin. At the University of Wisconsin, John Atanasoff would study quantum mechanics and theoretical physics at the doctoral level. Atanasoff was awarded his PhD by the University of Wisconsin in July 1930. He was 26 years old and had been married for 4 years. His daughter Elsie was just over a year old, and Laura was expecting a second child. His first job offer, assistant professor of mathematics and physics, came from Iowa State. His salary was to be $2,700 per year, $900 more than he had been making as a student teacher after receiving his master's. Jobs in physics were scarce, and Atanasoff once again committed himself to the Iowa State position, only to be subsequently offered a job at Harvard, which he once again turned down. Now, you might be wondering why John keeps turning down these offers from Harvard and is returning to Iowa State University, a much less prestigious institution. And it seems to me from reading his biography that he's a very kind of down-to-earth person, and he preferred kind of the Iowa setting as opposed to kind of the more upper class kind of Anglo aristocracy over at Harvard. So that's just a little bit of his kind of, again, his down-to-earth personality that kind of stayed with him throughout his life. While at Iowa State, John Atanasoff would work on developing calculating machines, calculators that would solve differential equations. This is a project that required quite a bit of proficiency in both advanced engineering and complex mathematics. While he was there at Iowa State, he was also assisting the company IBM in modifying its tabulators. However, IBM soon kicked John Atanasoff off that project due to his excessive meddling with IBM's technology. Atanasoff worked late at the office, worked at home, and read the newspaper at the dinner table. Home, like the office, was an arena for projects and creative thinking, not interaction, familial relationships, or leisure enjoyment. In fact, Atanasoff rather disdained pursuits such as art, music, and literature that Laura enjoyed. Laura understood Atanasoff's pressing commitment to solving the problem of calculating, both as an inner drive to solve the problem creatively and as an essential scientific task. Burton indicates that Atanasoff's frustration with the failures of the solutions he and his colleagues were coming up with in the mid-30s was making him moody and hard to live with, but also that Laura's own close-knit family of origin had not prepared her for the lonely life she found herself leading. Atanasoff was not happy. He wrote later, quote, "I had been forced to the conclusion that if I wanted a computer suited for the general needs of science and, in particular, suited for solving systems of linear equations, I would have to build it myself. I was leading a full life and had much to do. I did not want to search and invent, but sadly I turned in that direction." End quote. He feared he would be wasting his best years on an endeavor that might prove fruitless. He had no way of knowing who was inventing what in the world of computing, or how his thinking fit into that of the others. Even if it worked, his invention could easily be preempted by another. Now, by the late 1930s, John was getting quite frustrated with his lack of progress on the computing machine he was trying to come up with, trying to invent. In December of 1937, after a particularly stressful day, he decided to just get into his car and start driving just to kind of relieve some stress and clear his head. He eventually ended up driving quite some distance away from Ames, Iowa, away from Iowa State. He would cross the Mississippi River into the state of Illinois after several hours of driving, and he stopped at a roadside bar, a roadhouse, to get a drink. He went inside, sat at the bar, and ordered a bourbon whiskey. As he was sitting there drinking his whiskey, the ideas for the computer just started rushing to him. He grabbed a napkin and started jotting down all these ideas that were coming to him at that time, and those ideas would eventually lead to the invention of the first computer. Through 1938, Atanasoff worked out both the practical and the theoretical implications of the ideas he came up with in the tavern in Illinois. To reiterate, Atanasoff's four linked ideas were as follows. 1. Electronic logic circuits, which would perform a calculation by simply turning on and off. 2. Binary enumeration, using a number system with only 2 digits, 0 and 1, rather than 10, 0 through 9. 3. Capacitors for regenerative memory. A capacitor is like a battery in that it can store electrical energy while not connected to a source. 4. Computing by direct logical action and not by enumeration, that is, by counting rather than by measuring. The numbers repeated by rows of zeros and ones or the on-off states of the vacuum tubes would be directly added and subtracted rather than being represented by points on discs or shafts. Atanasoff did not have the money or resources to try to build any of his components, so most of the work he did was on paper and in his head. However, in March 1939, 15 months after the revelation at the Roadhouse, Atanasoff turned in an application for a grant of $650 to hire a graduate student in an attempt to build what he had conceived of. In May, his grant request was approved. $450 was salary for the student, and $200 was to go to raw materials. After receiving his funding from Iowa State University, Atanasoff would go on to hire an engineering student from the university named Clifford Berry. And Clifford Berry would assist Atanasoff with the engineering and the construction of the first computer, the Atanasoff-Berry computer. Once Atanasoff and Berry were ready to build, they had another piece of luck that at first looked a bit like a slight. When Atanasoff sought a workspace in which to build his computer, he was sent to the basement of the physics building because the first floor was taken up by projects already in progress and possibly considered to be more important. The basement was full of junk, and Atanasoff and Berry had to set up their workspace in an out-of-the-way, windowless corner. Atanasoff appreciated the privacy. He would later also appreciate the space's proximity to the machine shop and its steady, cool temperature. In Atanasoff's life, frugality had often meant that making do was making better. But space limitations and financial limitation also meant that Atanasoff and Berry had to reconfigure their plans into something smaller and more buildable. As Atanasoff later put it, quote, "We did not dare to build everything into our plans. Our skill as inventors depended on how well we chose between these factors, the indispensable and the impossible," end quote. What Atanasoff thought was most crucial were the instructions, that is, how he would set up the sequence of steps or algorithm that would perform the mathematical operation he wanted. He was still not quite clear about them when they went to work. While they were getting ready, Atanasoff did what he could to find out what other computer projects were underway around the country. As far as he could tell, no one was trying what he was trying in terms of concepts or hardware. Atanasoff and Berry worked on it through 1940, and Berry worked on it until June of 1942. The frame of the computer, now known as the ABC, or the Atanasoff-Berry computer, was 74 inches long, 36 inches deep, and about 40 inches tall. Berry used the angle iron to construct a table with two levels. One about 4 inches off the ground that contained the two boards holding the vacuum tubes and capacitors, which stood upright and faced front, along with several other components, including two transformers and a power supply regulator. Above that, at the back of the top table, were two drums, each about 11 inches long and 8 inches in diameter, several mechanisms for transposing binary numbers into and out of decimals, and a mechanism for charring holes into cards and feeding them back into the drums. Solving 29 linear equations with 29 unknowns was still a lengthy process, taking some 30 hours, and it required systematic inputs by a human operator. But it could be done, and the machine was accurate. Now, during this entire process of building and designing the Atanasoff-Berry computer, John Atanasoff became acquainted with another physicist by the name of John Mauchly. Now, John Mauchly was also involved in developing his own calculating machine known as the harmonic analyzer. And when John Mauchly heard about Atanasoff's work at Iowa State, he was very excited about Atanasoff's work and asked to come to Iowa in order to inspect Atanasoff's computer. Mauchly was eager for information and seemed receptive to Atanasoff's ideas, just what a man who was enthusiastic about his project and underappreciated would be looking for. In the 4 days that Mauchly and his son were in Ames, Iowa, Mauchly, Atanasoff, and a revolving set of onlookers spent hours in the basement of the physics building. The rest of the time, especially at home, Atanasoff and Mauchly talked incessantly about the machine, how it worked, what the principles behind it were, what Atanasoff's system consisted of. Mauchly seemed impressed. He carried the green-covered 35-page description around with him and asked to borrow it and take it back to Pennsylvania. Atanasoff would not allow this, but he did allow Mauchly full access to it while he was in Ames, and also allowed him to investigate the computer carefully with Clifford Berry. Sam Legvold, who was working in the next room on Atanasoff's defense project, later remembered that Mauchly had hands-on access to the ABC and even helped Berry do a few repairs. Legvold saw him touching parts and carrying parts around. At one point, Mauchly asked Laura for a stack of bond paper. Laura may originally have been offended by Mauchly's insensitivity as a house guest, but she became alarmed by some of his other activities. Laura was a busy seamstress who often stayed up at night sewing. She noticed that Mauchly was up late too, because the light in his room was on, and she suspected that he was writing. She feared that he was not only taking interest in the ABC, but also planning and working on stealing her husband's ideas. While Mauchly was in Ames, she warned Atanasoff not to talk as freely and in such detail as she witnessed him doing, and Atanasoff acknowledged her caution. But he did allow Mauchly free access to the computer, and he did answer his questions. He later said that his impression at the time was that Mauchly had neither the background nor the knowledge that would make him capable of stealing the ideas or understanding them well enough to be able to reproduce the ABC back in Philadelphia. For Atanasoff, the temptation to show off his invention was too great, certainly in part because even while the president of Iowa State was attempting to secure the future profits of the ABC, Atanasoff's colleagues were almost universally either skeptical about or indifferent to what he was doing. During the Second World War period, Atanasoff was actually involved in a lot of defense projects for the U.S. government, for the U.S. military. He was actually hired by the U.S. government to work in the Naval Ordnance Laboratory around Washington, D.C. There he led a bunch of projects for the Navy. Primarily his job there was to innovate naval mines so they wouldn't get triggered by enemy minesweepers in the ocean. While he was there in D.C. working at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, working about 60 hours a week, his family was still back in Ames, Iowa, and he would regularly travel back and forth from D.C. to Iowa by train, which was a 36-hour trip each way, and he would do this multiple times a month. Atanasoff directed projects on the acoustical properties of explosives, acoustical detection, acoustical location, and numerous other topics. He was so inventive that he was later cited for, among other things, quote, his unusual imagination and exceptional mechanical ingenuity, his enthusiasm and indefatigable energy and zeal, end quote. Part of his citation might have easily described the invention of the computer. He, quote, has succeeded in conceiving of the solution to an urgent military problem which had been considered insoluble. Having conceived of the answer to the problem, he saw it through design, production, and test to the final timely adoption despite almost insurmountable obstacles, end quote. Some of the men Atanasoff hired he knew from Ames. Almost all research not related to the war effort had been shut down by mid-1942, so there was a large talent pool to draw from. In the midst of all this, he had time for hobbies, one of which was comparative study of alphabets. On his visit to Ames, he tried to keep track of the progress of the patent application for the ABC, which his efforts proved frustrating. He was never able to find out exactly what the college was doing about the patent or persuade them to move more quickly. While John Atanasoff is working for the U.S. military, improving their naval technology and weaponry, John Mauchly and his partner Presper Eckert are involved in developing their own computer. The computer that Eckert and Mauchly would come to develop will be known as the ENIAC, or the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. Mauchly mentioned his machine for the first time in early 1944. He looked Atanasoff in the eye and he told him that he was building a computer. The new computer, Mauchly claimed, isn't anything like your machine, but it is better than your machine. When Atanasoff had asked about the new computer, Mauchly put him off, saying that it was top secret. Though Atanasoff's security clearance was higher than Mauchly's, Atanasoff knew he would not get anywhere by pressuring the other man. Atanasoff still believed at this point that Iowa State was likely to have filed the patent application. He knew that he himself would not have stolen another man's ideas, so he didn't suspect Mauchly. Indeed, Mauchly assured him that the principles behind the ENIAC were entirely different from those behind the ABC. A few months later, in August 1944, Atanasoff met J. Presper Eckert for the first and only time when Mauchly brought him to the gun factory in search of help with quartz transducers. Since Eckert did not have a high security clearance, the two men had to have a military escort, so the visit was brief and unrevealing. Although Atanasoff had agreed to help with the quartz transducers, he didn't see Mauchly again. It was only later that it occurred to him that quartz transducers could be used in a computer to regenerate memory. When it was completed, the ENIAC was huge. It weighed 27 tons, was 8 feet long, 8 feet high, and 3 feet deep. In addition to the 18,000 vacuum tubes, there were 7,200 diodes, 1,500 relays, 70,000 resistors, and 10,000 capacitors for memory storage. It required 150 kilowatts of power, equivalent to 1,500 100-watt light bulbs. Although Atanasoff was invited to the February 1946 unveiling of the ENIAC at the University of Pennsylvania and attended, the demonstration of the machine did not clear up any of the mysteries for him about how the machine worked or the principles behind it, and Mauchly and Eckert were not present. The purpose of the ENIAC was to accomplish what Mauchly had originally proposed, the calculation of artillery trajectories. It was so enormous and so expensive that Atanasoff was intimidated. Even so, not long after he saw the ENIAC, Atanasoff called Richard Trexler, the patent attorney in Chicago. Trexler told him that Iowa State had never paid to file the patent application, so he had not filed it. Atanasoff knew at that moment to patent his ideas was lost. ENIAC convinced him that computers had progressed. Either his ideas were obsolete or they were irrelevant. Computer technology, it was readily apparent, was now established and developing apace. Now, eventually, there would be massive disputes regarding the patent rights to the ENIAC. Who did the technology belong to? Did it belong to Mauchly and Eckert? Did it belong to the University of Pennsylvania, for whom they worked for? Or did the U.S. government have patent rights over the computer due to the funding they received from the federal government when creating the ENIAC? That is a dispute we will see will not get resolved for some time. But in the meantime, the ENIAC will be improved. There will be another individual named John von Neumann who will join the team along with Mauchly and Eckert. And the ENIAC will be upgraded and will come to be known as the EDVAC. Now, the EDVAC will then become improved upon itself by incorporating a lot of Atanasoff's ideas. Basically, the EDVAC will incorporate more thoroughly Atanasoff's ideas of using a binary numerical system as opposed to a decimal system. This team of von Neumann, Eckhart, and Mauchly would eventually produce subsequent versions of their computing machine, and eventually they'll come up with a version known as the UNIVAC 1. And the UNIVAC will be kind of well known as being the first general purpose electric computer that was marketed for commercial use. 46 UNIVAC 1 computers were manufactured, sold, and delivered to such companies as Metropolitan Life Insurance, Westinghouse, and U.S. Steel, as well as to government agencies, the U.S. Army Map Service, the Pentagon, and the Census Bureau. Although Mauchly had charged only $159,000 for the computer in the first contracts, the price eventually rose to almost a factor of 10. UNIVAC 1 gave way to UNIVAC 2 in 1958. Now, it should be noted that this entire period of the 1940s, throughout the Second World War and even after the war, put a great deal of stress on John's family life. Eventually, by the late 1940s, his wife Laura would leave him. They would get a divorce. She would take the kids and move to Colorado. John Atanasoff would remain in D.C. and continue working on his various projects there. In 1951, like Mauchly and Eckert, Atanasoff decided to go into private enterprise. But unlike them, he first mastered the basic principles of accounting, which took him 3 days, and of business law, which took him about a month. He wrote his own articles of incorporation and lured some of his fellow researchers away from the Naval Ordnance Laboratory. The plan was to offer testing services, especially to the military. The Cold War meant that there were lots of military contracts, and they were lucrative. He set up his offices in Frederick, Maryland, which he chose after studying the weather patterns in the Washington, D.C. area, and decided that, should there be an atomic attack, Frederick would be outside of the radiation plume, and therefore somewhat safer than his first location of choice, Rockville. With his unusual confidence and frugality, Atanasoff used his own savings as capital for his business, along with investments of those who would be working with him. According to Tamara Burton, the company, which operated on military contracts, was always solvent and never had to borrow money. Atanasoff now focused on his company and deliberately ignored what was going on in the world of computers. The testing Atanasoff's company performed ranged from determining how a projectile might approach and strike an airplane in flight to figuring out how to best drop leaflets on a populated area as a form of psychological warfare. The Army gave him that contract during the Korean War. Atanasoff's Ordnance Engineering Corporation had prospered. In 1956, it was bought for a healthy sum by Aerojet General Corporation, a California company specializing in rocket propulsion technology. Atanasoff took half his proceeds in cash and half in stock. Subsequently, the stock split so many times that Atanasoff became a wealthy man. Now, without getting into all the details and the complexities here, a patent war, which I briefly alluded to earlier, erupted between various people, various entities, and this patent war is basically to determine who has the legal rights to the computer and to the technology behind the computer. And this patent dispute is it will be based largely on who first invented the computer, who came up with the initial technology behind it. And by the early 1960s, there are a number of people kind of digging into this and investigating the computer's origins and going through the records to uncover who was initially behind the technology. Now, one of the investigators is an IBM engineer by the name of Richard Richards, who eventually would go on to write a book about the computer's history. And Richards would eventually go to, as his research and his investigations would lead him in that direction, he will go to Iowa State University to inspect the Atanasoff Berry computer and the developments of that computer. Once he gets there and kind of starts talking to people, he figures out that he needs to speak to John Atanasoff directly to learn more about the ABC's technology and the technology behind it. However, John Atanasoff at this point is very busy with his other projects and doesn't really have time to speak to Richards. Atanasoff tells Richards to go speak to Clifford Berry, as Clifford Berry can shine some more light on the technology, the development behind the Atanasoff Berry computer, and that's what Richards does. He goes directly to Clifford Berry, and Clifford Berry shares a great deal of information with Richards regarding the development of the computer and so forth. Having learned about the computer and the history behind it, behind the ABC, Richard then decides to speak to John Mauchly and requests a meeting with him. Mauchly did not respond to Richards' first letter and then did not return his calls, but Richards was persistent. When he finally reached Mauchly in the late summer, Mauchly was not happy to hear from him. He derided the ABC, but he did admit to staying in Ames for several days, looking at the computer and discussing with Atanasoff. Richards later wrote in his book, Electronic Digital Systems, quote, "The Atanasoff Berry computer does appear to predate every other electrical digital system by a matter of years," end quote. In the meantime, Berry decided to take another job, this time in Huntington, New York, on the North Shore of Long Island, at the Vacuum Electronics Corporation. He left Pasadena, California in early October and went to Long Island, stopping at a conference for a week on the way. He rented a room intending to look for a house, buy a new car, and prepare the way for his family to move east. The company agreed to his request to bring Jean Berry east to New York so that she could choose between the two houses. Berry called Jean every night, and he seemed to her to be excited about his new job and their new life. But on October 30th, before she was due to leave for New York, she received a phone call from the Huntington police. Clifford Berry had been found in his rented room, dead, with a plastic bag over his head. The cause of death was listed as a probable suicide. Prior to Berry's death, Atanasoff did not want to discuss the ABC because he was too upset about the destruction of the machine. But Atanasoff believed that Berry was murdered and thought that he would not have died if Atanasoff had not hired him to work on the machine. The death of Berry changed his attitude to the patent lawsuits, and he became quite energetic in pursuing the patent conflict. When Richard's book finally came out, it caused a wave of turmoil within this patent war, within this patent conflict, based on its findings and based on its determination that it was in fact Atanasoff and Berry who had invented the first computer. When Richard's book, Electronic Digital Systems, was published 3 years later, in 1966, some of the first people to read it were patent lawyers at several computer companies. One of these was a man named Alan Kirkpatrick, who had been hired by Control Data Corporation to defend CDC against a case of patent infringement brought by Sperry Rand. CDC was being sued along with Honeywell, and they decided to collaborate on their defense. Richard's book was sizable and respectable, given his earlier work. It was Richard who coined the term Atanasoff Berry computer, and in the book's preface, he stated point blank, quote, "The ancestry of all digital systems appears to be traceable to a computer which will be called the Atanasoff Berry computer," end quote. Since in spite of the lingering patent controversies, ENIAC was famous for being the world's first computer, it proved something of a shock to the computer world when Richard stated, quote, "There was, however, one interesting link between the machine and later work. One of the few people to study the ABC in detail was Dr. John Mauchly. According to oral reports from Dr. Atanasoff and Dr. Mauchly, the two met at an American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting. As a result of the conversation at the meeting, Dr. John Mauchly made a visit to Iowa State University in 1941 for the specific purpose of studying the computer. As mentioned later, Dr. Mauchly is given credit for subsequently initiating the ENIAC project. Now, as we just read, as a result of Richard's findings, there will be a landmark legal case, Honeywell Incorporated versus the Sperry Rand Corporation. Now, the primary issues in that legal case will revolve around the validity of the patent, which was filed by Mauchly and Eckert, and which was owned by the Sperry Rand Corporation. Atanasoff will be deposed as a witness, and he will turn over all his documents related to the Atanasoff Berry computer. There will be overwhelming evidence revealed throughout that case that Mauchly was in fact heavily influenced by the Atanasoff Berry computer. Atanasoff even turned over letters from Mauchly to Atanasoff in which Mauchly admits to this and even asks Atanasoff for permission to use the ABC technology in his own computer. On top of that, we had in the case several witnesses from Iowa State University who testified that Mauchly thoroughly inspected the ABC and the technology behind it prior to the invention of the ENIAC. Mauchly's testimony in the case was very inconsistent, and his story often changed and contradicted a lot of the physical evidence that was provided by Atanasoff and the other witnesses. The challenge to Sperry Rand's patents was lengthy and involved. According to Clark Mullenhoff, it consumed over 135 days or parts of days. A total of 77 witnesses had given oral testimony, and an additional 80 witnesses were presented through deposition transcripts. Honeywell had introduced 25,686 exhibits to be marked by the court, and the lawyers for Sperry Rand and its subsidiary, Illinois Scientific Development, had directed the court's attention to another 6,968 exhibits. The highly complicated trial transcripts stretched over 20,667 pages. Honeywell's brief, filed in September of 1972, was 500 pages long. The key claim in the brief was not that Atanasoff had invented the ENIAC, but that, quote, there is no difference between what Mauchly learned from Atanasoff in June 1941 and what Eckert and Mauchly were later to claim they had invented alone. In April 1973, Judge Larson sent copies of his proposed decision to both the Sperry lawyers and the Honeywell lawyers, asking for their responses. It was clear from the proposed decision that Larson was leaning towards abrogating the Sperry patents, but also that he was giving the Sperry lawyers one last chance to make their case. They could not make it. In October, Larson decided in favor of Honeywell in no uncertain terms. He stated, quote, between 1937 and 1942, Atanasoff, then a professor of physics and mathematics at Iowa State College, developed and built an automatic electronic digital computer for solving large systems of simultaneous linear equations. Now, what this court ruling did was it essentially invalidated the patent that was held by Mauchly, by Eckert, and by the Sperry Rand Corporation. However, in spite of the court's ruling, Sperry Rand launched a PR campaign maintaining their position that Eckert and Mauchly were the original inventors of the computer, not Atanasoff. Sperry Rand, John Mauchly, and J. Presper Eckert did not go down easily. They took advantage of the limited dissemination of the decision to continue claiming credit for inventing the computer. Possibly they did not understand the details of patent law that destroyed their claim. From the beginning, they seem not to have seen themselves as team members or as beneficiaries of social networks engaged in a common purpose, but rather as stars and owners who stood to gain fame and fortune. When they claimed ownership of more than 100 ideas in their 1947 patent application, or when they failed to acknowledge Atanasoff in the same application, they were setting themselves up for an eventual failure that might have been avoided with smarter legal counsel, more scrupulous honesty, or just possibly better record keeping. For years, Sperry Rand, Mauchly, and Eckert fought a rearguard action to retain PR rights to the invention, if not the legal rights. One patent lawyer of Wilmette, Illinois, recalls how difficult it was to get any mention of Atanasoff or the Larson decision into the Smithsonian exhibition on the history of the computer. Quote, in the 1980s, the Smithsonian Institution started work on an exhibit to commemorate the invention of the computer. Because it lacked funds to proceed on its own, the Smithsonian solicited and received computer industry funding. One of the most prominent contributors was Sperry Rand. The Smithsonian Institution took the position that contributions from Sperry Rand and other supporters of Mauchly and Eckert would not influence the content of the exhibit. Nevertheless, the exhibit as originally conceived did not contain any reference to Atanasoff's inventions or to Judge Larson's opinion. Instead, the Smithsonian credited Eckert and Mauchly with the invention of the electronic computer. Atanasoff's supporters strenuously objected and had some limited success in getting a very small portion of the exhibit allocated to Atanasoff's inventions. That same problem would reappear a few years later when PBS produced a program financed by many of the same contributors on the invention of the computer. Now, despite the efforts of the Sperry Rand Corporation, recognition of Atanasoff slowly would become public. Atanasoff was not without his own advocates and promoters. While the trial preparations were going on in 1970, Isaac Auerbach happened to meet a Bulgarian mathematician named Blagovest Sendov at a conference in London and mentioned John Atanasoff. Sendov was immediately interested and did some of his own checking into the case. He also wrote Atanasoff, requesting information about his father, Ivan. Eva Purdy Atanasoff, then visiting John and Alice was John's second wife, put together her memories, and Sendov used this information to find Atanasoff's relatives in Bulgaria. Atanasoff was invited to return for a visit, and while there in 1970, he was awarded the Order of Cyril and Methodius First Class for inventing the computer. He was also shown around the city of Sofia and taken to Boyajic in the Yambol district where his father was still remembered. Atanasoff's real passion late in his life became languages and alphabets. He viewed the Bulgarian version of the Cyrillic alphabet with 32 letters until 1945 and 30 letters thereafter as superior to the English alphabet, and when interested groups wanted to talk to him about the invention of the computer, he wanted to steer the conversation towards the benefits of reinventing the alphabet. He told a Bulgarian newspaper in 1985, quote, I hear them. I hear the voices and the hearts of the people who pronounce them. I want each letter and each symbol to carry more meaning, to support the full power of the alphabet, end quote. Atanasoff gained more and more recognition for the invention of the computer as the 20th century progressed, in spite of his omission from the MIT website. He was celebrated at Iowa State in 1974, and he was the subject of a meticulous biography that focused on the relationship between the ABC and the ENIAC by Arthur Burks and Alice Rowe Burks, who had worked on the ENIAC in 1989 called The First Electronic Computer, The Atanasoff Story, as well as a biography called Atanasoff, Forgotten Father of the Computer by Clark Mullenhoff, a writer for the Des Moines Register in 1988. The Burkses, according to Tamara Burton, had been unaware of the ABC until they wrote an article for the Annals of the History of Computing about ENIAC. They read the transcripts from the trial and wrote, quote, Atanasoff's principles for electronic computation played a crucial role in the circuitry of ENIAC and all its successors, end quote. But the Burks' book was published by the University of Michigan Press, and the Mullenhoff book was published by the Iowa State University Press. Burton's own excellent book, which contains more personal information about Atanasoff, was published in 2006 by the All Bulgarian Foundation and the Center for Research on the Bulgarians. In 1990, Atanasoff went to the White House and received from George H.W. Bush the 1990 Medal of Technology for his invention of the electronic digital computer and for contributions towards the development of a technologically trained U.S. workforce. He was also nominated for the Nobel Prize in Physics 3 times during the 1980s, but since his 35-page paper describing the Atanasoff-Berry computer and other papers concerning the theoretical and technical aspects of the ABC were never published, he was not eligible. Atanasoff died on June 15, 1995. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.